The story begins not in the spotlight of Capitol Hill, not in the echoing chambers of the Senate floor, but in a small, dimly lit apartment on the edge of Washington, D.C. It was a warm summer night when a young woman's body was discovered sprawled across a velvet sofa, a half-finished glass of wine beside her, and a single letter folded neatly on the table. To the casual eye, it might have looked like the tragic ending of a troubled life. Another story of loneliness in a city that devours the weak. But this wasn't just any woman. She was the mistress of one of the most powerful senators in America. And her death, though labeled a suicide by officials within hours, would unravel into one of the darkest political scandals of our time. For the public, the headline was simple: Senator's secret mistress dead, apparent suicide. Mainstream outlets framed it as tragic but inevitable. They painted her as unstable, fragile, unable to handle the pressure of a hidden affair with a man who could never publicly acknowledge her. It was neat, clean, and, most importantly, convenient. Within days, the story had already begun to fade from the news cycle, buried under a pile of manufactured distractions. But behind closed doors, whispers told a very different tale. Neighbors reported strange noises the night before her death, the sound of shouting, of something heavy falling to the floor. A maintenance worker claimed he saw a man in a dark suit leaving the building around midnight, long before the body was officially discovered. And then there was the phone. Her cell phone, once constantly buzzing with texts and calls, was nowhere to be found. The only electronic evidence police recovered was her laptop, conveniently wiped clean before they ever arrived. Suicide? Or something far more deliberate? This is where Empire Leak steps in. Because this isn't just a story about a senator's affair, or a woman's tragic death. This is about power. How it seduces, how it corrupts, and how it silences. The mistress wasn't just someone's lover. She was someone who knew too much. Someone who, according to those closest to her, had threatened to go public with everything she knew. Not just about her affair, but about the money trails, the backroom deals, the kind of secrets that could end a political career overnight. And for a man climbing the ladder toward presidential ambitions, that was a risk too great to ignore. Imagine the scene. A senator at the height of his career, a wife and children polished into the perfect public image, speeches about morality and family values echoing across campaign stages. And in the shadows, a woman who held the receipts, who could destroy everything with a single press conference. The tension between them was electric, dangerous, inevitable. When she died, the question wasn't whether it was suicide. It was how long the system could pretend it was. In the hours following her death, the machinery of politics moved faster than any grieving family member could comprehend. Police reports were stamped and sealed. Autopsy results rushed. Reporters instructed to move on. The senator issued a carefully worded statement of deep sadness, but quickly pivoted to respecting the privacy of the family. Behind him stood his advisors, lobbyists, and donors, not mourning but calculating. Because in Washington, every tragedy is also an opportunity. And every scandal, if buried deep enough, can be repurposed into a story of survival. But this is not a story that stays buried. Because the deeper you dig, the more the cracks begin to show. Why were there inconsistencies in the medical examiner's report? Why did two witnesses who claimed to hear a struggle suddenly recant their statements? Why was her last journal entry missing, torn from the pages as if ripped away by someone who didn't want it read? And most hauntingly of all, why did her closest friend say that, just days before her death, she had confessed, "If anything happens to me, it won't be by my own hand"? These are not coincidences. These are not oversights. These are the fingerprints of a cover-up. A cover-up designed not just to protect a senator's reputation, but to preserve the illusion that America's political elite are untouchable, unshakable, incorruptible. But as you'll see in the chapters to come, illusions are fragile. And the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, has a way of clawing its way back into the light. So tonight, we take you beyond the headlines. Beyond the polished speeches and the smiling photographs. We take you into the shadows, where loyalty turns into betrayal, where ambition turns into blood, and where the life of one woman became the price of protecting a man's political empire. This is not just the story of a senator and his mistress. This is the story of murder, lies, and the cover-up they buried. On the surface, Senator Richard Holden was everything America wanted in a leader. His silver hair and carefully chosen words made him the picture of dignity. He spoke of family values with a smile that charmed every television camera. His wife, Margaret, stood by his side like a statue carved from marble. Elegant, loyal, immaculate. Their children, dressed in matching outfits during campaign season, waved from podiums as though plucked straight from a Norman Rockwell painting. For decades, the senator built his brand on being not just a politician, but a symbol of integrity in an age when corruption seemed to seep through every crack of Washington. He wasn't merely a senator. He was marketed as a statesman. And in politics, image isn't everything. It's the only thing. But behind the glossy photographs and scripted speeches lay a very different Richard Holden. Those closest to him knew the truth. He was a man obsessed with power. Every dinner party, every handshake, every backroom meeting was another step toward one destination: the White House. And in the climb to that pinnacle, morality became a prop, family values a costume. He knew what the cameras wanted, and he gave it to them. But the moment the red light of the broadcast turned off, Holden was a man who lived by one rule: protect the empire at any cost. It was during a late-night fundraiser that he first met her. Vanessa Cole, a striking woman with an effortless charm that could silence a room. She wasn't part of the Washington elite, not the daughter of a dynasty or the graduate of a private Ivy League circle. She was ordinary in the ways that made her extraordinary. A woman who worked her way into political circles not by inheritance, but by persistence. When she laughed, people leaned in. When she spoke, even seasoned strategists listened. And when Senator Holden saw her, something in him shifted. To the outside world, he was the devoted husband, but to himself, he was still a man of flesh and temptation. The affair began quietly, discreetly. Hotel rooms booked under false names. Weekend trips disguised as policy conferences. Late-night phone calls that stretched until dawn. In Washington, such affairs are hardly unusual. The city is littered with them. But what made this one dangerous wasn't the betrayal of his wife. It was the betrayal of his image. Holden had built his career on moral superiority. To be caught in an affair would be more than a scandal. It would be the demolition of his entire brand. And yet he couldn't stop. Vanessa was not just a lover. She was a confidant. She listened to his frustrations, soothed his ego, and unlike his polished political handlers, spoke to him without fear. But with intimacy came vulnerability. And with vulnerability came risk. Vanessa wasn't content to remain in the shadows forever. As months turned into years, she began to realize the imbalance of their relationship. He had the power, the influence, the family name. She had secrecy, promises, and loneliness. And loneliness has a way of sharpening into resentment. Whispers began to spread among Holden's inner circle. Advisors noticed his sudden disappearances, the unexplained expenses, the late-night mood swings. A single photograph, captured by an anonymous source, showed Holden and Vanessa leaving a hotel together. It was never published, but it circulated quietly among Washington insiders, a ticking time bomb waiting for the right moment. Holden's staff worked overtime to keep rumors suppressed, calling in favors from editors, leaning on allies to quash stories before they reached daylight. But for every secret buried, another seemed to rise. Behind closed doors, Holden's marriage was fraying. Margaret Holden, the dutiful wife, had played the role of political partner for years. But she wasn't blind. She knew about the phone calls, the absences, the lipstick stains that didn't belong to her. And though she remained silent in public, in private she began keeping her own records. Photographs, notes, financial statements. For her, it wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. Because in a marriage tied to politics, betrayal isn't just personal, it's strategic. The cracks in Holden's perfect image were widening. And Vanessa, once content with secrecy, began pushing back. Friends say she started talking about going public, not out of spite, but out of desperation. "I'm tired of being invisible," she reportedly told one confidant. "If he won't acknowledge me, the world will." She kept journals, notes of their conversations, even saved voice messages. She wasn't naive. She knew the danger of holding secrets about a man like Richard Holden. But what she may not have known was that secrets in Washington don't just destroy reputations, they end lives. And so the senator's double life reached a boiling point. On stage, he was still the perfect politician, shaking hands, kissing babies, preaching about morality. But off stage, he was a man cornered by his own desires, desperate to keep control of the narrative. Because in Washington, truth is never what the people see. It's what the powerful allow them to see. And Vanessa was about to become the one thing Holden couldn't control. A truth that could end him. The affair was no longer just a personal weakness. It was a threat. A threat to his career, his marriage, his ambitions. And in Washington, threats don't go unanswered. To the media, she would always be labeled the mistress. A throwaway word meant to erase her humanity, to reduce her life to nothing more than a scandalous footnote in the career of a powerful man. But Vanessa Cole was more than a mistress. She was a daughter, a friend, a dreamer who once believed that Washington was a place where someone like her could make a difference. To understand the magnitude of her death, and the shadow it cast on the halls of power, we need to remember her not as an accessory to a senator, but as a woman with her own story. Vanessa grew up in Baltimore, the second of 3 sisters raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. From an early age, Vanessa understood struggle. But she also understood resilience. Teachers described her as fiercely intelligent, the kind of student who didn't just memorize lessons but questioned them, challenged them. She was a debate champion in high school, her sharp tongue and quick wit earning her the nickname, the prosecutor. For Vanessa, education was her way out, a ticket to something bigger. She put herself through college with a mix of scholarships, part-time jobs, and sheer determination. By the time she graduated, she had already set her sights on Washington. She wasn't naive about politics. She knew it was a dirty game, but she believed she could play it without losing herself. Her early jobs in D.C. were modest: assistant to a junior lobbyist, communications intern for a non-profit. But everywhere she went, people noticed her presence. She had the rare ability to make anyone feel like the most important person in the room. It was this quality, her charisma, her empathy, her unshakable confidence, that eventually caught the attention of Senator Richard Holden. What began as professional admiration quickly morphed into something deeper. At first, Vanessa resisted. She knew the risks, knew the stigma of being involved with a married man, especially one who wrapped himself in the banner of family values. But Holden was persistent. He showered her with attention, made her feel seen in a city where so many young women were invisible. To Vanessa, he wasn't just a senator. He was a man who listened to her, who confided in her, who made promises about a future that, deep down, she wanted to believe in. But affairs are never balanced. While Holden had the safety net of power and influence, Vanessa was left carrying the weight of secrecy. She cancelled plans with friends, dodged questions about her love life, lived in the liminal space between public and private. For years, she told herself it was temporary, that eventually he would leave his wife, that their love was worth the sacrifice. But as time dragged on, the illusion began to crack. Vanessa wasn't just someone's secret. She was a woman who wanted to be acknowledged, respected, visible. And the longer she remained in the shadows, the more she began to resent the man who kept her there. Her journals, recovered after her death, paint a haunting picture of this internal struggle. In one entry she wrote, "He tells the world he believes in truth and integrity, but he hides me like a stain. I am not a stain. I am his truth." In another, "They think he's perfect. If only they knew the things he's told me, the things he's done. I could end him with one press conference." Vanessa was not the fragile, unstable woman the headlines later described. She was calculating, methodical. She collected evidence, not just of their affair, but of his political dealings. Emails, phone records, even photographs. She knew what leverage looked like, and she knew how to use it. Friends recall her saying half-jokingly, "If he ever betrays me, I'll have enough to bring the whole house down." It was a dangerous kind of power, and in Washington, dangerous power rarely goes unchallenged. In the weeks leading up to her death, Vanessa began to shift. She grew more restless, more outspoken. She confided to a close friend that she was tired of living in the shadows. "He made me promises," she said. "If he won't keep them, then I will tell the world who he really is." Whether she intended to expose their affair out of love, betrayal, or a desire for justice, no one can say for certain. But one thing is clear. She was preparing to act. She had started reaching out to journalists, feeling them out, hinting at a story too explosive to ignore. And this is where her fate was sealed. Because the moment Vanessa stopped being a secret and started becoming a threat, her life moved onto dangerous ground. She was no longer just the woman behind the curtain. She was the woman who could pull the curtain down. To some, Vanessa's story might seem like a cautionary tale about ambition, love, and betrayal. But to those who knew her, it was about something more profound. The courage to demand visibility in a world determined to erase her. She wanted to be seen, not just as a mistress, but as a woman who mattered. And that desire, that refusal to remain invisible, may have been the very thing that cost her everything. So when her body was found in that dimly lit apartment, with officials rushing to call it a suicide, the people who truly knew Vanessa didn't believe it. They couldn't. Not the woman who had fought her entire life to be heard. Not the woman who kept receipts, who played the long game, who knew exactly how much danger she was in. For them, the story of her suicide wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A beginning of a cover-up that stretched all the way to the highest offices of power. And that's where the truth begins to unravel. The official record says Vanessa Cole died alone. That on a humid night in late June, she poured herself a glass of wine, wrote a brief note of despair, and quietly ended her life. That's the version the public was fed. Swift, simple, and tragically believable. But like so many official records, it collapses under the weight of scrutiny. The first red flag appeared almost immediately. The timeline. Neighbors in her building reported hearing raised voices late that night, a man's voice among them. One resident swore she heard a woman cry out, followed by a loud thud. Yet, when investigators filed their report, they made no mention of these accounts. No interviews were conducted with the neighbors. The narrative of suicide was locked in before the sun even rose the next day. Then there was the scene itself. Friends who later viewed leaked photographs of the apartment noticed strange inconsistencies. A half-drunk glass of wine sat next to Vanessa's body, but toxicology reports showed almost no alcohol in her system. The note allegedly written by her hand was oddly generic, almost sterile. No trace of the sharp, defiant voice that filled her journals. And most damning of all, her cell phone was missing. For a woman who lived on her phone, texting, recording, documenting, its absence was glaring. The autopsy deepened the mystery. The medical examiner declared the cause of death as self-inflicted, but several medical professionals who later reviewed the report noticed anomalies. Bruising on her arms that didn't align with a simple suicide. A lack of defensive wounds, but enough force markers to suggest restraint. And then there was the matter of timing. The coroner's report was released in record speed, stamped and sealed within 48 hours, unheard of for a case with such political weight. It felt less like science, more like choreography. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate in Washington. Reporters who dug into the story found themselves stone-walled. One investigative journalist claimed her editor killed the piece after a late-night phone call from a concerned party. Another described being followed, her emails mysteriously hacked. It was as if an invisible hand had reached out to smother the story before it could take breath. And yet, fragments of truth still leaked. A hotel staffer claimed to have seen Vanessa with a man in a tailored suit just 2 days before her death. A security guard reported an unmarked black SUV idling near her building on the night in question. Small details, easy to dismiss in isolation, but when placed together, they painted a picture not of suicide, but of orchestration. Her friends were unconvinced from the start. They described Vanessa as restless, yes, but not defeated. Days before her death, she had lunch with a confidant where she excitedly spoke about going public. She hinted at having documents, recordings, proof that could destroy the senator's career. "He won't be able to hide anymore," she reportedly said. Those aren't the words of a woman preparing to end her life. Those are the words of a woman preparing to fight. So the question became, who silenced her? And why? For Senator Richard Holden, the timing was uncanny. His presidential campaign was in its planning stages. Major donors were lining up. A single scandal, especially one involving infidelity, could cripple his ambitions before they began. Vanessa, with her journals, her recordings, and her growing defiance, had become a ticking time bomb. To his allies, eliminating her wasn't just convenient. It was necessary. But murder in politics is never messy. It is never obvious. It is designed to look exactly like what they claimed it was. A sad, unfortunate accident or, in this case, a suicide. By the time Vanessa's body was lowered into the ground, the official narrative was airtight. But beneath the polished statements and sympathetic headlines, the air in Washington smelled of blood. This is the moment where the story of Vanessa Cole shifts from tragedy to conspiracy. Where the threads of lies begin to unravel, and the cover-up becomes as sinister as the crime itself. In Washington, A cover-up doesn't look like men in trench coats burning papers in back alleys. It looks like lawyers drafting statements, journalists redirected to other stories, and officials quietly making phone calls that never appear on the record. Vanessa's death was no exception. The machinery of silence roared to life the moment her body was found. First came the statement. Within hours, Senator Holden released a carefully worded note expressing his shock and grief over the passing of a dear friend. To the casual observer, it seemed heartfelt. But to those who understood political language, it was a masterpiece of deflection. By calling her a friend, he stripped the relationship of its intimacy. By expressing grief but urging privacy, he closed the door on questions before they could be asked. It was not mourning, it was damage control. Next came the police report. Drafted hastily, it leaned heavily on the suicide narrative. No mention of neighbors hearing voices. No acknowledgement of the missing phone. The inconsistencies in the autopsy were glossed over with medical jargon. To the public it was official. To insiders, it reeked of manipulation. Behind the scenes, the senator's allies went to work. Editors at major outlets were quietly contacted. Stories were spiked, leads abandoned. A reporter at a national paper later admitted off the record, "We had the goods, but the order came down from the top, let it go." In Washington, careers are built not only on breaking stories but on knowing when to bury them. Meanwhile, those who dared to question the official story faced consequences. One whistleblower within the police department who raised concerns about the rushed investigation found himself reassigned to a desk job in another precinct. A junior staffer in Holden's office who leaked that Vanessa had been calling repeatedly in the days before her death suddenly resigned, citing personal reasons. Even Vanessa's closest friends felt the pressure. One woman who claimed Vanessa had confided about going public was visited by two men in suits who warned her not to get involved. She never spoke publicly again. And then there were the missing files. Vanessa's journals, partially recovered, were mysteriously incomplete. Whole sections torn out. Her laptop, once filled with emails and notes, had been scrubbed clean. Friends insisted she kept a second set of records, a backup in case anything happened. But if those existed, they were never found. Or perhaps they were found and buried where no one would ever see them again. The efficiency of the cover-up was chilling. It was not the work of one man panicking to save his career. It was the work of a network, political allies, law enforcement, media executives, all moving in quiet unison to erase a woman's truth. To the system, Vanessa wasn't a victim. She was a liability. And liabilities are erased. For the public, the story faded quickly. Within weeks, Vanessa's name barely appeared in headlines. Senator Holden's career marched on, untarnished. To those watching closely, it was proof of how deep the rot ran. Because if a woman could be silenced so efficiently, erased so thoroughly, then what else had been buried beneath the polished surface of American politics? The cover-up wasn't just about protecting one man. It was about protecting the illusion of the system itself. Because if the truth had come out, that a senator had orchestrated or even been complicit in a mistress's death, it wouldn't just have ended his career. It would have cracked the entire facade of American democracy. But cracks have a way of spreading. And despite their best efforts, fragments of Vanessa's story survived. A stray email. A whispered confession. A leak that slipped through the cracks of the cover-up. Enough to keep the embers of the story alive, waiting for someone willing to fan them into flame. And that someone was coming. 4 months after Vanessa Cole's death, the silence held. The senator's career continued unscathed, his public appearances calculated and flawless. The media, cowed or complicit, had turned the page. But in Washington, truth rarely dies. It waits. And sometimes, all it takes is one person brave enough, or reckless enough, to dig. That person was journalist Daniel Mercer. Mercer wasn't a household name. Not yet. He was the kind of reporter who thrived on scraps, piecing together stories from fragments others dismissed. When Vanessa's death hit the headlines, he felt the same frustration everyone else did. The story didn't add up. Unlike his colleagues, he couldn't let it go. Quietly, carefully, he began to collect everything he could about Vanessa, about the senator, about the weeks leading to that June night. At first, he found little more than rumors. But then, one evening, an anonymous envelope arrived at his apartment. Inside were copies of emails, text message logs, and financial statements. The sender? Unknown. The content? Explosive. The emails painted a chilling picture. Vanessa had not been spiraling into despair as the official narrative claimed. She had been planning. Correspondence showed she had contacted at least 2 journalists, offering to share information that will expose the truth about a certain senator. In her messages, she hinted at having proof of illegal campaign donations, shady real estate deals, and even secret meetings with foreign lobbyists. She wasn't bluffing. Attached to the emails were snippets of bank transfers linking the senator's associates to shell companies overseas. The text logs were even more damning. Vanessa had exchanged heated messages with Halden in the weeks before her death. In one, she accused him of using her and warned, "If you won't keep your promises, I will keep mine." His replies were colder, clipped. "You don't understand what you're doing," one message read. Another, "Stop this now before it gets out of hand." The final message she sent, hours before her death, simply read, "You'll regret this." That text was never mentioned in the police report. And then there were the bank records. Large sums of money moved from accounts linked to the senator's PAC to untraceable offshore holdings. On their own, they might have been dismissed as creative bookkeeping. But paired with Vanessa's notes and her communications, they suggested something darker. Bribery, corruption, perhaps even foreign influence. She had been holding a time bomb. And she knew it. Mercer quickly realized what he was holding could destroy careers. Not just Halden's, but the entire network that supported him. But going public wasn't simple. Every step he took was watched. His phone calls crackled with interference. His email was hacked twice. He noticed unfamiliar cars parked near his apartment. The invisible hand that silenced Vanessa was now reaching for him. Still he pressed on. He contacted Vanessa's closest friends, pieced together her final days, corroborated the documents. One friend revealed that Vanessa had given her a USB drive for safekeeping just days before her death. On it were recordings of private conversations with the senator. In one chilling clip, his voice could be heard saying, "You know what happens to people who cross me. Don't make me choose between my future and you." The files, emails, texts, recordings, financials, were undeniable. They showed not only that Vanessa had been silenced but why. She had held the kind of truth that could bring down an empire. When Mercer attempted to pitch the story, editors recoiled. Some feared lawsuits. Others hinted that pressure from upstairs made it impossible to run. The cover-up machine was still in motion, bigger than any one journalist. But Mercer wasn't deterred. He knew he couldn't rely on mainstream channels. If the story was going to come out, it had to come out another way. So he began leaking pieces. Small fragments, carefully timed. A snippet of a recording here. A financial transfer exposed there. Each leak stoked public curiosity, reignited whispers, and made it harder for Halden to keep his polished image intact. The cracks were spreading. The perfect senator was beginning to look less like a leader and more like a liar. Vanessa had tried to speak in life. Now, through her files, she was screaming in death. The first crack in Senator Halden's empire appeared during a live interview. A journalist, emboldened by the recent leaks, asked about the alleged offshore accounts. Halden laughed it off, dismissing it as conspiracy theory nonsense. But the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. For the first time the mask slipped. And the public noticed. From there, the leaks gained momentum. Independent outlets picked up the story, amplifying what mainstream networks refused to touch. Hashtags trended on social media. Hashtag Vanessa Cole, hashtag Halden Files, hashtag Justice for Vanessa. Citizens began demanding answers. Candlelight vigils appeared outside Vanessa's apartment building, her name becoming a symbol of silenced truth. What the system had buried was clawing its way back into the light. Halden's campaign scrambled. Advisors urged him to cut ties, to blame rogue staffers, to distance himself from Vanessa entirely. But every denial only fueled more suspicion. Protesters began appearing at his rallies, holding signs with Vanessa's face, chanting her name. His speeches, once commanding, were now drowned out by the roar of accusation. And then came the whistleblowers. A former aide, emboldened by the growing movement, revealed that he had been ordered to clean Vanessa's laptop before police arrived. Another insider admitted that calls from the senator's office to law enforcement pressured them to close the case quickly. The dominoes were falling. The breaking point arrived when Mercer released the full audio recording from Vanessa's USB drive. The clip spread like wildfire. The senator's voice, unmistakable, could be heard warning Vanessa. "If this gets out, you'll ruin everything. Don't test me. You know how this ends." Within hours, the recording had millions of views. Within days, it had sparked a national uproar. Holden tried to fight back. He called the recording a fabrication, accused his opponents of political sabotage. But the evidence was overwhelming. Fact-checkers confirmed the audio's authenticity. Experts verified the financial records. The story was no longer just rumor or speculation. It was proof. Proof that a U.S. senator had not only lived a double life but may have played a role in the death of the woman who threatened to expose him. Congressional hearings were called. Holden sat stone-faced as lawmakers grilled him on the leaks. His carefully crafted image, the family man, the moral leader, disintegrated under the glare of cameras. For the first time, his wife Margaret was absent from his side. The optics were devastating. The whispers had become shouts. The cover-up had become a scandal too large to contain. But perhaps the most powerful moment came not from politicians, journalists, or whistleblowers, but from Vanessa's mother. Standing before a crowd of reporters, tears streaming down her face, she said, "My daughter was not a mistress. She was a woman who deserved to live, who deserved to be heard. And they silenced her. But they cannot silence me." Her words cut through the noise, piercing the political theater with raw human grief. At that moment, Vanessa Cole's story transformed from a scandal to a movement. She was no longer just the mistress. She was a symbol of every truth buried by power, every life destroyed by ambition, every woman erased by the men who feared her voice. For Richard Holden, the breaking point had arrived. His empire was crumbling. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, was finally clawing its way to the surface. The fall of Richard Holden was not a sudden implosion but a slow, agonizing collapse, the kind that plays out in headlines, subpoenas, and damning television soundbites. 4 years he had been untouchable, the golden boy of American politics, the man pundits predicted would one day sit in the Oval Office. But now the veneer was gone, stripped away piece by piece until only the rot underneath remained. It began with his donors. The same corporations and lobbying groups that once filled his campaign coffers began to distance themselves, quietly pulling funding. Their press releases were sterile and carefully worded. "We have decided to suspend political contributions pending further review." In reality, they were jumping ship before it sank. Without money, the gears of Holden's political machine ground to a halt. Campaign staff fled, aides resigned, and offices that once buzzed with activity fell silent. Then came the lawsuits. Vanessa Cole's family, armed with Mercer's files and a growing army of pro bono lawyers, filed a wrongful death suit against Holden. The discovery process alone threatened to unearth even more secrets, more recordings, more financial corruption. Other suits followed, whistleblowers suing for retaliation, watchdog groups demanding transparency, even disgruntled former allies seeking immunity in exchange for testimony. Each one added weight to a man already buckling under the pressure. The media, once hesitant, now swarmed. Late-night comedians mocked him, documentary crews began producing exposés, and once friendly journalists sharpened their knives. The narrative had shifted irrevocably. Holden was no longer the future of politics but a cautionary tale, a man undone by greed, lust, and hubris. But the most devastating blow came from within his own party. Behind closed doors, party leaders calculated the cost of defending him. He was toxic, radioactive. Protecting him meant sacrificing elections, credibility, and perhaps even the party's future. So, they did what political machines always do when a cog breaks: they replaced it. Holden found himself isolated, cut off from the very allies who once cheered his rise. His name disappeared from campaign rallies. Endorsements evaporated. He was a ghost long before he left office. The Senate hearings dragged on for months. Holden sat there, hollow-eyed, as investigators played Vanessa's recordings, projected financial records on massive screens, and dissected his every word. The man who once commanded rooms with charm now looked small, cornered, desperate. His lawyers objected, filibustered, stalled. But the truth was relentless. It kept resurfacing, no matter how deeply they tried to bury it. In one unforgettable moment, a young senator leaned forward and asked, "Mr. Holden, did you love Vanessa Cole?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine. Holden hesitated, lips trembling, before muttering, "I cared for her." It was neither a confession nor a denial, but it was enough. Cameras zoomed in, commentators pounced, and across the nation, viewers saw not a leader but a liar trapped in his own contradictions. As his legal troubles mounted, his personal life unraveled. His wife filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Friends stopped answering calls. Old allies turned state's witness. Even his children, once photographed beside him as proof of his perfect family, retreated from public view. By the time the indictment came, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and possible complicity in Vanessa's death, the empire of Richard Holden was rubble. Once hailed as a symbol of American promise, he was now just another cautionary tale. Another man who thought he was bigger than the truth. And through it all, Vanessa's face lingered. On protest signs. On murals painted across city walls. On the front pages of magazines. She was no longer the mistress, no longer a footnote. She had become the story. The woman who refused to be silenced, even in death. The woman whose truth tore down a titan. In the aftermath of the scandal, America asked itself an uncomfortable question. How many Vanessas had there been? How many voices silenced? How many truths buried? How many women written off as unstable or disposable because powerful men needed them erased? Vanessa's story was singular in its details but universal in its pattern. And that is why it resonated. 4 months after the hearings, her name became a rallying cry. College campuses hosted panels on women in politics, investigative journalism, and systemic corruption. Documentaries chronicled her life, not as a mistress, but as an aspiring journalist, a woman who wanted to expose the truth. Activist groups adopted her name for campaigns demanding reforms in how political scandals are investigated. The Vanessa Act, a bill proposed in Congress, sought to limit the influence of political pressure on local law enforcement. It didn't pass immediately, but it sparked a conversation too loud to ignore. Her mother, once broken by grief, became her fiercest advocate. She toured the country, telling Vanessa's story in churches, community centers, and town halls. They tried to silence her, she would say, but when they did, they gave her a louder voice than she ever had in life. Crowds wept, cheered, and chanted Vanessa's name. In those moments, it was clear. The senator's empire had crumbled, but Vanessa's legacy had risen. Even Richard Holden, now disgraced and awaiting trial, couldn't escape her ghost. Every article about him carried her name. Every legal motion referenced her case. In trying to erase her, he had immortalized her. But the most powerful legacy wasn't in laws or headlines. It was in the quiet courage she inspired. Whistleblowers began coming forward in other cases, citing Vanessa as their reason. Journalists, long cowed by political intimidation, rediscovered their edge. Ordinary citizens, once apathetic, began demanding accountability from leaders who thought themselves untouchable. Vanessa Cole, the young woman once dismissed as a scandalous footnote, had become a symbol of defiance. Years later, on the anniversary of her death, thousands gathered outside the White House, holding candles. The crowd was diverse: students, mothers, politicians, journalists, ordinary citizens. At the center stood a mural 10 feet high, painted in bold strokes of red and black. Vanessa's face, split between light and shadow, smiling yet fierce. Below it were the words, "You cannot silence the truth." And in that moment, as the candles flickered and chants rose, one truth became clear. Vanessa Cole had been taken too soon, but her story had not been in vain. She had cracked open the facade of power, exposed the rot within, and left behind a legacy that could not be buried. The senator's mistress? No. She was something far greater. She was the woman who brought an empire to its knees. Power falls. Secrets surface. And the stories they tried to bury are the very stories we live to tell. If this truth moved you, don't let it fade into silence. Subscribe to Empire Leaks, because every view, every share, every voice added here makes it harder for them to hide. Hit that bell, so the next time the powerful stumble, you'll be the first to know why. This is Empire Leaks. And the story is never over.